Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host George Bogdan. Joining us today is Mark Galeotti, widely considered one of the world's most premier historians of the Russian state and a leading expert on its security and intelligence apparatuses. Mark is an honorary professor at University College London and a senior associate fellow at RUSI. A prolific author of over 30 books, his latest work, Forged in War, provides a definitive military history of Russia from its origins to the present day. Having advised everyone from the UK Foreign Office to NATO, Mark has a peerless ability to ground today's headlines in deep historical context. Mark, it's an honor to have you.
Hello there. I'm delighted to be here.
You've been banned from Russia, an honor I do not yet have. You've written more than 30 books on the country, and you've just said that Putin's Victory Day parade was a sign of real vulnerability. Let's start there. What did the parade tell you that the official commentary missed?
I think it's about authority, really. The parade is really a performative spectacle. It's all about saying that Russia is great, and by virtue of extension of that, Putin himself is great. And to have it, it was a perfectly reasonable parade by most standards, but compared to previous Victory Day parades, it was a very sad spectacle. And in that case, particularly given that in many ways it was a sad spectacle because the Ukrainians made it so, just by the sheerest threat that they might do something pyrotechnic and drone-related about it, it meant that Putin was, in effect, losing the initiative to Zelensky. It meant that he couldn't guarantee, when really he frankly could, but anyway, he couldn't feel he could guarantee security in the very heart of his capital city. And this was beamed to the entire global, but also particularly Russian population. More than 30 million people tune in to watch this parade. And in that respect, given that authority is something that has to be continually reaffirmed and once again performed, that's why it becomes a weakness for him.
I could have missed it, but I didn't see any tanks or missiles like you usually see. Just cadets and I think North Korean soldiers. You've called this a sign of real vulnerability. Walk us through what the Kremlin was actually trying to communicate or what they were hiding with that choice.
Yeah, in terms of the parade, exactly. There was no military hardware of any kind except in a sort of 10-minute video showing, which again is a little bit sad to, in effect, relegate most of your armed forces to the mid-break commercial. And it was just, marching soldiers, including, as you say, North Koreans. No, but essentially what the parade is meant to show is, first of all, it's a display of military might. Well, a bunch of guys marching past, however much in lockstep they may be, does not necessarily convey that. Quite the opposite. Secondly, it's about international connectivity. It's about at a time when the West is trying to isolate Russia diplomatically. It's a way of saying, no joy there. And if we think of last year's, which was the 80th anniversary of, as they call it, the end of the Great Patriotic War, we had Xi Jinping, we had all sorts of dignitaries from around the world. This time, well, in the last minute, they had the president of Kazakhstan turn up. They had Robert Fico, the president of Slovakia. But apart from that, it really was a very, and I apologize to the countries in question, but it was B-list distinctly. So, it didn't show that. Thirdly, it's a chance for him to sort of basically assert himself in front of the nation, and exactly there it fails. And even his speech, he gives this big set-piece speech. It's Victory Day, but he had no victories to report. Quite the opposite. It's essentially, it was a, basically keep calm and carry on. Yes, it's victory is forward ahead of us, just over the horizon, trust me. But in the meantime, accept the privations, the hardships and so forth, because Russians are beginning to really feel the pinch. And finally, it was a chance to, in some ways, set the agenda in terms of the war and how Russia can get out of the war. And although there are some signs of at least a sort of a behind-the-scenes debate about whether you continue, whether you actually have some kind of genuine peace process or whatever, even that, he couldn't bring himself to actually give some kind of programmatic view of the future. He just relied on his boilerplate. So really, in all of those respects, quite frankly, it failed. And look, it's not disastrous. It's not meaning that he's going to be toppled next Thursday or anything like that. And talk of coups and such like is very wild and implausible. But nonetheless, it's not just that he missed the opportunity to advance his position. He actually ended it weaker than he went into that day.
You say Russians are beginning to feel the pinch. Something like 40% of all their money goes towards just buying food and basic necessities. How is it that the elites in the country are still able to govern and to maintain power when 40% of all discretionary spending is on money or is on food?
Well, Russians, yes, they're feeling the pinch, but they started from a relatively high level. It's worth noting, after all, that the first couple of full years of the war saw actual standards of living increase because salaries went up, and there was in many ways, artificial bump in GDP, but quite dramatic. It's artificial because, in a way, it was defense spending on stuff that then was just being driven out to then be blown up on the battlefield. So it wasn't really particularly productive. But nonetheless, we got to understand that, Russia is a relatively prosperous middle-income country. So it's not like people were close to the breadline just because it's getting a bit worse for them. In other aspects of their lives, actually, they're still relatively sort of padded and so forth. But above all, look, this is a thuggish police state. When it comes down to it, you're not necessarily in a happy position, but you only protest, firstly, if you can organize, and it's very difficult to do so, but also if you have some genuine prospect that things are going to get better if you do so as a result. There's no real opposition. There's certainly no opposition structures left. The one thing that this regime is very good at is precisely stepping hard on anyone who challenges it. So from their point of view, look, for most people, and it doesn't matter, frankly, if you're a member of the elite or just some ordinary citizen somewhere out in the boonies, the safest thing is just to hunker down, grumble around the kitchen table, but essentially just hope that things work out okay. And a final point, Russians are essentially patriots, like most people. Even the ones who didn't want this war, and look, I know, I still talk to a lot of my contacts and friends and so forth back in Russia, some of whom are pro-regime, many of whom are not. But even those who are thoroughly anti-Putin, when it comes down to it, you didn't want your country in this war, but if it is in this war, you'd rather it win than lose. And therefore there is that sense of, well, look, now is not the time to be rocking the boat.
Yeah. I recently, Putin said, he thinks the war is coming to an end, or coming to a natural conclusion, depending on how you would translate it. What are we to make of that? Do you think that it's kind of a cynical ploy? Where do you think that's sort of leading us in terms of understanding him and his views of things?
Yeah, he wasn't really suggesting it's going to come to an end because I'm going to be making compromises. In part, it was absolutely a cynical ploy. He has to have something to say. And he wants to say that there are sunlit uplands just over the horizon. Just hanging in there. We're going to be there soon, rather than, oh boy, are we in a bad spot? It's going to be years and it's going to get worse. He's enough of a politician to say that. But at the same time, I think there's two strands of opinion which are currently competing for Putin's attention. This is the weird thing. For all his macho posturing, Putin is very bad at making decisions. When it's a tough decision, he sits on the fence as long as he possibly can. And while that happens, you tend to have different factions vying to win things over, because you can't go to Putin and say, you were wrong in 2022 when you invaded Ukraine. However much, I think the majority of the elite would absolutely feel that. But what you can just simply say is, there is a window of opportunity here. So you have the hawks, the security interests, who are basically telling him, the Ukrainians going to break soon, or the Europeans are no longer going to be able to bankroll the Ukrainians for long. The Ukrainian people will get fed up with being conscripted and so-called bussification, where people are sort of grabbed, put into buses to be driven off to a draft office, or Zelensky's corruption scandals are going to catch up with him, or whatever is the current fantasy of the moment, or indeed just on the battlefield, which we're just about to take that last bit of Donetsk region, and then we can claim that we've taken all of the Donbass. So there are those who tell him that it's going to be fine, that you just, keep your nerve, and soon you will have a victory to proclaim. But then increasingly we're seeing, really from the beginning of this year, which I think is the real development, even from within the president's own bloc, particularly within the sort of political technologists within the presidential administration, that is an incredibly powerful institution. People just trying to float the idea that this is the time where really the law of diminishing returns is kicking in. That, we can spend another year fighting and another 200, 300,000, whatever, Russians killed and wounded. And we won't really make any particularly significant gains on the battlefield. So why not be thinking now about some kind of process, because we can spin it as a great triumph and everyone will be relieved. And so, but again, they can't say this openly. So we're seeing almost a war of leaks. We've seen approval ratings showing that his approval ratings are down. I mean, still a level that most Western politicians would happily kill their grandmothers for. But nonetheless, by the standards, it's the lowest it's been since the start of the war.
How high are they?
Well, I mean, his approval rating is just over 60%. But again, that's artificial when you don't have anyone to be benchmarked against. But his trust ratings, which in some ways I think are a lot more indicative, are, depending on how you count it and which poll you use, in the high 20s, low 30s, which is the bizarre situation, which means that half of the people who approve of Putin don't trust him. But I think that's because in some ways they're thinking in different terms. But one way or the other, it is clear that his legitimacy, his support has been sliding steadily. But these poll numbers would not have been released unless they had been greenlit from within the presidential administration, because they come from government polling agencies. We've seen a report came out that was commissioned by the presidential administration, which was precisely how to spin just basically freezing the war now as a victory. And even Putin's own United Russia Party, which is a completely sort of cynical, bought and paid for bloc. But they have recently publicly released their talking points for canvassers about tough questions you're going to be asked on the doorstep. And in a way, that's a way of kind of indicating to Putin that tough questions are being asked on the doorstep. So, we've got a situation where no one can actually go to Putin and say, come on, for God's sake, man, end this war. But they're just simply saying things could get worse, but we reckon that the status quo could be spun, and then sanctions would, at least American sanctions, would be lifted, and this, that, and the other. So there is a war for Putin's ear going on at the moment. Now, at the moment, Putin doesn't seem to be inclining, I think, seriously towards peace. But nonetheless, it's clearly swirling around somewhere about him.
Well, let's back up a little bit. What does he get out of this war? How does it help him maintain his stature among the elites? Why has he continued to do it 4 years in without victory being apparent?
Because once you're in the war, you've got to have a victory. Look, remember, Putin did not think for a moment that he was starting a major war. He has this very bizarre notion of Ukrainians. I mean, and the interesting thing, this dates back to before he was president. This conviction he has that Ukraine isn't really a country. Ukrainians are not really a people. That Eastern Ukraine is basically a bit of Russia that Lenin stole from Russia to create this fake Ukrainian state back at the founding of the Soviet Union. And that Western Ukraine, well, frankly, is probably basically a bit of Poland with the serial numbers sort of filed off. So he has a very low opinion of Ukrainians generally. And he had been flattered and fed information to support that. Remember, even back it was 2015, I was having tea in Moscow with a relatively recently retired Russian spy who said, even back then, 7 years before the invasion, he said, look, we have learned you do not bring bad news to the Tsar's table. In other words, you don't give Putin your best truth. You tell Putin what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. So anyway, he convinced himself that essentially the Ukrainian people were at best looking for Russia to come in and impose a new leadership, and at worst just simply would accept it when it happened. So he thought he could just roll in. It wasn't a 3-day war, as some people have claimed, but nonetheless, he had said that basically, within a few months, he anticipated you'd roll in, impose a new government. You would have to fight some units of the Ukrainian military. But to be honest, the main problem you anticipated was riots. It's a reason why a large portion of the invasion force was not army, it was the National Guard, which the Russian National Guard is not like the American one. Essentially, it's a paramilitary internal security force, a gendarmerie. So they thought basically riot control was going to be one of the main problems. And within a few weeks and months, they could have pulled out their troops. The West would have huffed and puffed, but just as it always did in the past, wouldn't really have done anything. And it would have been really the crowning triumph of his career. But once you suddenly find yourself stuck in an incredibly hard-fought war, he can't just simply say, whoops, oh, well, that was worth a go. Never mind, didn't quite work out. Again, there's always that sense of you double down because, a bit of a sunk cost fallacy, bit of a sense that actually, well, surely the Ukrainians aren't going to be able to keep this up. Surely the West aren't really going to be providing much support. Surely we're not going to face serious sanctions for long. Again, that sense that you keep doubling down. And so now, in some ways, I think he feels on the hook. He needs to have something that he can call a triumph, or at least spin as a triumph. And for some reason, he's convinced himself that, at the very least, basically being able to claim that all of the eastern Donbass region is now, quote unquote, liberated. It means that he's basically continuing to fight for about 20% of one of the Donbass regions, Donetsk. It's the so-called fortress cities. It's going to be a really hard nut to crack. And if the Russians do take these cities, by the time they've taken them, they will just be rubbled wastes that the Russians will then have to very expensively rebuild. But still, at present, he seems to feel that is his kind of minimum level so that he can actually hold his head up. And remember, it's not just about holding on to power, though that is a key element of it. It's also his place in history. This is the one thing that we do know, that Putin has this perverse fascination. He keeps comparing himself with various, Peter the Great and other sort of state-building heroes of the Russian pantheon. He asks historians this question, how will they be writing about me in 50 or 100 years' time, which is an incredibly uncomfortable question to be asked by the despot of a country who has people poisoned. But it gives us a sense that he's thinking not just about his political survival, but his political legacy.
Well, let's turn to that real quick. What will his political legacy be if we're sitting here in 2040, 2050, or 2100? How will history remember him compared to the Peter the Greats or the Tsars or who else?
No. Look, for me, the best historical comparison is Ivan the Terrible. Because Ivan the Terrible is fascinating. If you look at Ivan the Terrible's career, he was not a nice man, but nonetheless, the first half of his reign, way back in the 16th century, was actually incredibly successful. It was a period of expansion of Muscovy, breaking of the Kazan Khanate, which was one of the great sort of enemies, the beginnings of the building of the institutions of the Russian state. If you look at the Russian Foreign Ministry or Interior Ministry or whatever, they actually track their own histories back to Ivan's reign, the first standing army, the sort of Streltsy. But then as he became increasingly autocratic and, to be honest, increasingly insane, he basically ripped apart and almost destroyed the state that he managed to build. And with his death, since he had also had the rather poor manners to murder his son and heir, his death started the process which led to this period called the Time of Troubles of civil war, instability, foreign invasion, and so forth. So, it's that sort of a reign of two halves. But ultimately, look, I think Putin will be, and I'm sure it'll hurt him to hear this, but nonetheless, well, he shouldn't have banned me. Think of it as a transitional figure, as the last real gasp of Homo Sovieticus. Because if you look at it, him and the people who surround him, who are pretty much all similarly septuagenarian ex-KGB types who haven't been able to cope with the idea that Russia is no longer, or Moscow rather, is no longer the capital of a global superpower. They have so many of the attitudes and prejudices and expectations of that kind of Soviet elite. Now, I'm not saying that the next generation are that much nicer, but they are different. They are definitely a post-Soviet generation.
Yeah, do you think that we're giving Putin a little bit too much credit sometimes? When I think of past sort of Russian or Soviet leaders that he reminds me of, I think of Brezhnev, who, is kind of the first of the gerontocrats, kind of dealt with, he known for obviously his doctrine associated with him, willingness to engage in brutal violence to keep the Soviet empire together, but also this kind of deeply underwhelming element of stasis. Maybe I'm misreading Brezhnev's career, but second longest serving Secretary General of the Soviet Union, and at the same time just sort of presided over a kind of smoldering of the empire, not massive kind of leaps forward, not the shoe banging on the table, but kind of the unhappy ending.
Yeah, but there's an interesting parallel there because, again, actually, the funny thing is when Brezhnev came to power, he was seen as a relatively young go-getter. I mean, by the standards of the Soviet elite. And in fact, the first period of the Brezhnev years seemed to be really quite successful. We had notional nuclear parity with the United States, a period of economic growth and development, just simply because, if nothing else, a lot of the lunacies of the Khrushchev era were abandoned. And it didn't hurt that oil and gas prices were high, just as they were in the first part of the Putin years. But yes, there is a definite Brezhnevian tone that has really kind of crept into Putinism, that it is gerontocratic, because it's not just him, 73 years old or whatever. It's fascinating that he's keeping people in power because he doesn't want churn. He doesn't trust the new generation. He doesn't know them really. So increasingly, we have him holding on to sort of 70-plus-year-olds. Chief of the General Staff is 70. The security chiefs are all over 70 and so forth. Now, it doesn't mean to say that you can't be over 70 and able. But it does mean precisely you've got younger generations that are getting increasingly frustrated, quite frankly, and sort of looking at their watches and wondering when their time in the sun will be. You have an elite which really doesn't truly understand the modern world. Putin famously doesn't use a smartphone, doesn't really use the internet, and so forth. And the shifts in power, the rise of China, Putin clearly still has this notion. I mean, on the one hand, he flatters the Chinese and he needs the Chinese, but also I think he still has this notion that somehow they can still be the little brother, which is clearly ludicrous. But again, a generation that can't truly let go their old ideas. So yes, as the economy slides into shabby stagnation, as a gerontocratic leadership don't really understand the modern world and are too timid to do the kind of dramatic things that might change the situation. And although obviously this is a much more massive war than the war in Afghanistan, but again, an imperial war that was stumbled into because they thought it was going to be quick and easy, and because they didn't really understand quite what kind of a country they would be going into. In this respect, Afghanistan and Ukraine have got some interesting parallels, because if in probably no other way.
There's a bit of a taboo on succession talk in Russia, to say the least, but you've said that these conversations are happening in elaborately allegorical terms. If Putin's gerontocracy is alienating these 50 and 60-year-olds that you're talking about, the next generation of officials and the people who have to pick up the pieces, how does that tension manifest itself in actual policy decisions on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, again, for a lot of it, let's be honest, it's just people are just keeping their head down because they are unhappy with the situation, but the risks of going against Putin are massive. The difficulties in kind of establishing some kind of conspiracy or whatever are very great. And therefore, it's just safest, again, just keep your head down and hope things work out for the best. But on the other hand, what is clear is that Putin's key role in the system, until relatively recently, was as the final arbiter. He played divide and rule. And this is about the one thing he did really well. I mean, this is the disappointing thing for me. I mean, I've been following Putin's career since before he was president. I've written about him. I watch pretty much everything, every interview he gives or whatever. And I still regard him as a deeply boring and rather flawed figure. But the main thing is that he was very good at that. And, in arbitrating different interests and disputes and such like. So he's, constantly keeping everyone else both off balance, but also needing him. Now he's much less visible doing that. He's handling things clumsily. He just can't be bothered in many cases. Again, 26 years in direct and indirect power, you get lazy and complacent, I think. And so what we're seeing is increasingly sort of horizontal alliances being formed, people trying to sort of, in a way, sort things out themselves without going to the old man. It was interesting, actually. My last trip to Moscow, which was in November 2021, was the first time, just shamelessly eavesdropping on conversations in the street, I heard people use the term starik, old man, to mean Putin. And so I think what we're seeing is a kind of an elite that is, in some ways, kind of getting into survivalist mode. building the alliances, building the resources, because you think things might go badly. You don't you don't know for certain, and you hope it won't. And I think there's a lot of people who are hoping Putin just doesn't wake up one morning. And then Prime Minister Mishustin steps in as, according to the Constitution, as acting president, and then there have to be early elections and such like. But one way or the other, things could get very messy, or they're not. So people are just kind of preparing what kind of resources they can, because that's about all you can do.
I have very little in common with Vladimir Putin, but I've also been called deeply boring and a very flawed character. Look, Ukraine has been systematically targeting Russian oil infrastructure, refineries, ports, export capacity, and Russia reportedly has lost like $2 billion just in March revenue alone. Does hitting the economic engine change his calculus in ways that sheer battlefield losses do not?
To a degree is the unsatisfying answer. Absolutely, it has an impact. We have to realize that at the same time, ironically, first of all, any reductions in market capacity actually increases prices. So you're exporting less, but maybe you can get a bit more out of it. There's a massive debate. It's the usual situation. You ask 5 economists, you'll get 6 opinions back. So it's hard to be absolutely sure at this point about sort of precisely the level of economic damage. And also, a lot of these facilities, frankly, can be and are repaired quite quickly. I think the importance is twofold. One of them is absolutely the price tag that is put on it. Remember, the majority of Russian defense expenditures are not pegged to external sales. So it's not like they need the money in order to buy weapons off someone else. And secondly, that in fact the Russian state does basically taxes at production rather than sale level. So when the oil or gas is pumped, then that's when it's taxed. And the company then hopes to, obviously make its money when it exports it. So it's not a direct correlation that losses immediately translate into revenue losses. And I know that's a very boring distinction, but it's an important one. So that's the first way in which it does have an impact, but not quite as great maybe as we think. But the second thing is the political impact. And again, I think, remember, all wars are ultimately political acts. That all wars are won by breaking the other side's will and capacity to keep fighting, rather than because you kill all the soldiers on the battlefield. And in that respect, the spectacle of continued Ukrainian drone strikes, which, although, they are discussed in the official media, though there's always an attempt to downplay it. But the point is, you can't pretend when there's been another huge pyrotechnic blast and a great plume of black smoke, you can't just simply say that nothing has happened. So people know what's going on, and Russians are exceedingly internet connected, and despite the attempts to control it, more than half of all Russians use VPNs to bypass state controls. So the fact that the Ukrainians, who 2 years ago, maybe they were able to sort of hit border regions with some relatively small drones, now can reach such a sort of huge area of Russia, and actually are targeting economic targets rather than in the main civilian targets. We do have the odd civilian target getting hit, and civilians getting killed, but nonetheless, that's clearly not the primary target. I think as a warning to Russians about how the trajectory of this war is going, in contrast with the upbeat rhetoric we get from the old man in the Kremlin and his various sort of propaganda outlets, I think that is important. And if you look at Russian social media, there is much more awareness of this. Particularly when it's, for example, Tuapse, which is a port refinery city which has been hit multiple times with, frankly, massive ecological consequences for the region. And you've got a lot of Russian civil society mobilizing to come and help, wash down dogs that have been covered in toxic oil and whatever else, but also to actually help the people. Well, all of that is actually deeply subversive of the state, because it questions the state's capacity and will to protect ordinary Russians, because that was always kind of part of the implicit social contract. This war is being fought by volunteers who are being paid eye-watering amounts of money in order to go and fight. You don't have to go and fight if you don't want to. And if you don't, basically this war is not going to affect your lives. Well, now, between the economy and also the drone strikes, this war is reaching everyone. And the drone strikes are also leading to internet connectivity issues and people sort of having their mobile internet sort of cut off. All of these ways, the war actually is expanding its footprint in Russia and amongst the lives of ordinary Russians.
Fascinating. I think really what's special about your work is how long you've actually been chronicling Russia and, kind of its relationship to the Soviet Union. And I wonder, if you were to think about what are the important kind of bits of connective tissue between, Putin and that former regime. You said that he was kind of the last of the Soviet kind of leaders. I mean, what would you say it is? I mean, would you say it's that he watched the decline himself from, a house in Dresden, or would you say it's that, his first boss was Anatoly Sobchak, or, what about his kind of relationship to that regime is the most important thing for us to understand?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. Off the top of my head, I'll give you three kind of points. First of all, what's really interesting is that Putin, like pretty much all of the people in his circle, they were not members of the nomenklatura, the old Soviet and increasingly hereditary elite. So actually, they were the first in their families to break in. So, suddenly they had a glittering future ahead of them. And that glittering future was then lost when the Soviet Union and the Communist Party collapsed. And that sense of what have we lost has definitely sort of metastasized into and who took it from us. So I think that there's a much greater sense of loss than, let's say, if you were, a golden kid, born to a nomenklatura family, you probably had a really good education, you had more resources to fall back on when the Soviet Union collapsed, you probably had a rather easier life in easing yourself into that transition. The second point is, you mentioned Dresden, Putin's rather undistinguished KGB career that brought him there. And he was there when East Germany basically fell apart. And again, that clearly was traumatic for him. Because, look, East Germany, in some ways, it was more Soviet than the Soviet Union. It seemed to be the place where actually everything, relatively speaking, worked and was under control, and yet how quickly it fell apart. So this is a man who's had not one but two authoritarian regimes fall apart, East Germany and then the Soviet Union. And the lessons that he seemed to learn from that is, A, that just simply the mob is a dangerous thing that needs to be kept under control, and B, that the mob will come out of away from control if the leadership is not tough enough. He sees that the problem with the East Germans and then with Gorbachev in the Soviet Union was precisely that they just were not tough enough. If they'd been more brutal, if they had just been more authoritarian, then their systems would have survived. So I think it's that kind of traumatic experience of seeing systems collapse around him that scared him. And the third point I would make is actually kind of sort of post-Soviet, but 1990s. When you had this extraordinary, messy, anarchic transition to, well, what was meant to be capitalism, but wasn't really capitalism because the Russians didn't understand what capitalism was. They thought it was just simply buying and selling things and making money without appreciating the whole underpinnings of trust and institutions, which actually makes real capitalism work. And this was a period in which precisely everyone was monetizing whatever they had, whether it was corrupt army officers selling off guns or trying to actually sell a submarine to the Colombian mafia, or whether it was officials in offices selling access and contracts and permissions. And that's where Putin made his money. He was deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. Anatoly Sobchak, who was a fascinating figure, but I think it's fair to say did not necessarily live by his salary alone, gave him a very long leash. And this is the time when he was dealing with gangsters, he was dealing with domestic and foreign companies. He put himself in charge of the committee that gave out licenses for casinos. And, some people find ways of making illicit money out of the gambling industry. One way or the other, again, I think that sort of what was really crucial was this kind of, it was all the primal id of a Soviet citizen, because all Soviet citizens had to play the black market. They might go along to a Communist Party meeting and extol the virtues of the writings of Marx and Engels, but then they would go and sell whatever they possibly could, steal whatever they possibly could just to get by. All of that was suddenly liberated. In some ways, this is what we saw in the 1990s, and particularly from Putin. It was all the worst instincts of a Soviet citizen suddenly liberated without all the controls of the Soviet system. So I think that's Gorbachev. Sorry, Putin. There you go. It's a low achiever who suddenly had glorious possibilities taken away from him. Someone who is scared by the mob when he sees regimes collapse because, as far as he's concerned, the government isn't strong enough. And someone who, when he gets the chance, is happy to break every rule and flout every law in the name of making money and looking after his friends.
Fair enough. Final question for you. What does a post-Putin Russia look like? That's a wide and broad final question. But
yeah, I mean, I'm glad this is a 3-hour podcast so that I can kind of properly sort of expand on it. No, I mean, look, on the one hand, I mean, actually, it's not going to be a very happy place for a while because, I think, firstly, the scarring effect on the economy of the measures necessary to fight this war are going to take not just, more than just simply years to play out. I was talking to a British Ministry of Defence economist a couple of weeks back who said that, we're at a place now where basically every 2 to 3 months and the war continues, the effect on the economy will take at least a year to play out. So there's going to be a long tail, let alone the demographics and the impact of the return of all these battle-scarred, often criminalized, deeply traumatized veterans, all of that. But on the other hand, in terms of, if we look at the sort of the system, look, I think it's fair to say that Russians have had a chance at least being aware of the fact that they have agency. And I don't think they're actually surrendering that. There is still civil society now, even amidst all the oppression and violence. And as regards the sort of leadership, look, I am kind of in some ways unfashionably optimistic for all the worst reasons about Russia, in that, again, if I look at the next political generation down, and I think when Putin goes, there will be a generational shift. It's not going to be another 74-year-old or whatever taking over. If I look at the 50-something and 60-something-year-olds, these are not nice people. These are not Democrats. These are not liberals. They are kleptocrats. They are pragmatic, opportunistic kleptocrats in the main. But the thing is, when it comes down to it, look, we in the West, we do know how to deal with kleptocrats. We do it all the time. These are people who, they just really want to be in a position where they can steal on an industrial scale and then enjoy that. And what's the point in doing so if you can't park your yacht safely off the French Riviera without it being impounded, and you can't send your kids safely to an American university, and you can't get spare parts for your BMW, and so forth. They want to feel reconnected with the world, and they are also scared of China. I mean, again, it's an interesting generational thing that Putin doesn't seem to really see the threat because from his point of view, essentially it's going to be a problem for his successor. Whereas the next generation down do not want to think that by the time they become heads of this state, it's already become a Chinese vassal state or just simply trapped within the gravitational field of the Chinese economy. So I think these are people who, will want to maintain a kind of soft authoritarianism at home, but will be much more pragmatic in terms of foreign relations. But final bit of sort of hope, it's like Pandora's box, there's always got to be a little bit of hope right at the bottom, is, look, kleptocrats steal, but once they've stolen pretty much everything that isn't nailed down and then taken the nails too, they usually then want to have a kind of rule of law in order to fix what they've already stolen and allow them, above all, to be able to pass it on to their chosen successors legally and in a protected manner. That's often how actually legality emerges. Now, it's clear that you can have rule of law without democracy, but you can't have democracy without rule of law. That's in a way what Russia tried in the 1990s, one of the reasons why the democratic experiment there failed right from the beginning. So we could have a kleptocrat generation who, while stealing, actually bring in a greater degree of rule of law to Russia, which might mean that the next political generation has a chance, and no more than a chance, to actually be a democratizing generation. Again, look, ultimately, I'm a historian by training, so I'm happy thinking in longue durée terms. Is Russia going to be a democracy in 5 years' time? No, absolutely not. Does Russia have a chance of being a democracy in 50 years' time? Yes, absolutely. It might not, but it's not necessarily damned to never, ever be anything other than a thuggish authoritarianism.
Okay. Well, Mark, thank you for that incredibly thought-provoking context and your insights. For our listeners, where can they continue to follow your work, and what's the latest book you have out? Tell us about it briefly.
Well, the latest book actually I have out is not a Russia-centered book for once. In some ways, it's a bit of it was more a hobby project, Homo Criminalis, How Crime Organizes the World. Although it clearly has to be said that as a book about organized crime and society, clearly Russia does pop up once or twice within it. But it's essentially an attempt to, on the one hand, do an organized crime history of the world, or a history of the world told through the spectrum of organized crime, and then to think about how it underpins modern society and how it might change. So, if you've ever wondered about Aztec cocoa bean counterfeiting, or why there were so many eunuch Chinese bandits, Homo Criminalis is the book for you. But apart from that, I do write quite a bit, but I also enjoy presenting my own weekly podcast, In Moscow's Shadows. And, well, beyond that, there's a fair amount of Galeotti out there.
Fair enough. Well, thank you again. I'm looking forward to having you on at the end of the war, assuming that is relatively soon. And also, once there's a new leader in Russia, we're going to have a special episode, maybe in person, because I think that would be quite interesting. We'll get some Russian vodka, which I think George enjoys, and we'll go from there. But thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And given that I don't imagine I'm going to be able to get back to Russia until we have a new leader, there'll be all sorts of reasons to celebrate.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.